and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week I am joined by Jenny Chan from Pacific Atrocities Education to speak on the Pacific Theater during World War II and the time just before it. Pacific Atrocities Education works to continue to raise awareness and spread knowledge surrounding the Pacific Theater. Before we get into the episode, I will put in a content warning here. We go into extensive discussion on various atrocities enacted on human beings, including assault and experimentation. With that, let's get right into the conversation. So, welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I'm joined here today with Jenny Chan from Pacific Atrocities Education. Jenny, do you want to introduce yourself a little?
Yes, I'm the director of Pacific Atrocities Education. I spent the last 10 years researching really about World War II in Asia.
Awesome. So today we're going to talk a little bit about World War II more from the perspective of the Pacific Theater. Jenny's going to talk a little bit about the time before World War II, what kind of led up to what we know like canonically to happen in World War II. So Jenny, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because normally when we talk about World War II, we are thinking about like Pearl Harbor, and that's what got America into Pacific War. But the war in China actually started 10 years before that. It started with the invasion of Manchuria. And at the time, China was very weak. So it's not like what we're thinking about, like in terms of China today is very big and, it's somewhat more powerful now than, 20 years ago. It was a very weak warlord era. And so Japan was kind of able to occupy Manchuria and then call it Manchukuo. And even though that the League of Nations did not acknowledge and kind of condemn Japan for it, Japan was able to just walk out of League of Nations by like 1933. And this is way before even the war started in Poland. And so a lot of people think that, World War II started in 1939 in Poland, but in a way, for Asia, World War II already got started in 1931 by September 18th. So that's what we've been kind of researching on. And also, of course, the occupation of Manchuria also led to Unit 731 because the scientists of Unit 731 was very interested in basically putting a lab there since Manchuria is very rural. And Unit 731 was like a human experimentation lab that was doing all kinds of human experimentation, including like vivisection and also like testing how things like powderizing anthrax and also like testing people on frostbites and also testing biological weapons that were later deployed in the middle of the war.
Well, those are some really heavy topics, and I think that we should probably start with maybe the invasion of Manchuria.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good one. It started with a false flag attack. So Quantum Army staged a bomb in Manchuria and the railway. And the interesting thing is that like the bomb was so weak that even hours later, a train was able to pass through it because they were saying that, a rogue force in China had planted this bomb on the railway that gave them kind of an excuse to go in and basically take Manchuria.
So after they took Manchuria, what happened next?
Yeah, so they occupied Manchuria and they were building all kinds of economic plans. For example, they had a Mitsubishi airplane plant there in Manchuria. And then they were also using forced laborers to have, for example, mining operation. And Kishi Nobusuke, who became a Class A war criminal, but of course, during the Cold War, Eisenhower got him out of war crimes jail, Sugamo prison, and installed him as Prime Minister of Japan. In the 1930s, he was coming up with like economic policies on Manchuria. And so he basically had 4 million forced laborers to build this kind of utopia, basically economic exploitation in Manchuria. Like 40% of those laborers died from like building things like, what I was saying, Unit 731, and also like other plants and mining operation as well. Because in order to build empire, you need economic kind of like a powerhouse. And there were also a lot of farmers' disputes. For example, they promised a lot of Japanese people that there's going to be free land in Manchuria. They showed up, they were expecting to be settlers and have kind of a free land, but then they ended up with a lot of land dispute, and those land disputes often became bloody.
So, with this occupation happening in that time before what has been made the official start of World War II, how does that transition as the war period starts? Like, as we get into what we know as the World War II years, how does the invasion of Manchuria develop over time?
Yeah, so eventually, between 1931 to 1941, kind of the West largely tolerated this destruction of China by Japan. For example, US was still selling steel and oil to Japan. And even Helen Keller was protesting about US selling steel and oil to fund this kind of destruction of China at the time. And by 1937, because Japan just kept expanding its empire. And so by 1937, it started a kind of almost a full-scale war with the Battle of Shanghai, and which what led to they thought they can take Shanghai within days, but Chiang Kai-shek, who was actually leading the Chinese army at the time, thought that he could use Shanghai as kind of like a battleground to prove how capable Chinese army was. And so because Shanghai was like an international area, so he thought that, okay, we're going to have press here to film this. And so he kind of used it as kind of like a media outlet to show how his soldiers can hold off Japanese forces. And what's interesting is that so Battle of Shanghai ended up taking months. And by the time that the Japanese were done fighting, it led to the rape of Nanking because of how frustrated the Japanese were in Shanghai. And that led to like 6 weeks of killing and just brutal massacre in Nanjing in 1937. But what's also very interesting within this time period is that before the Battle of Shanghai in 1932, the Japanese, with the Shanghai incident, there were a lot of reported rapes by the Japanese soldiers in Shanghai. And so by kind of they knew to discipline their soldiers, but then they kind of also institutionalized like prostitution. So then they started this comfort camps in China as well, which would later be used in places like the Philippines after Pearl Harbor and in Southeast Asia, basically wherever that Japan was occupying, that they would build these comfort stations and round up local girls and then call them comfort women, which is basically they would then be subject to rape basically every day. But because it's institutionalized as a comfort station, then it's no longer illegal. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense.
And so that was happening in China between like 1931 to like 1937 with the rape of Nanking being very brutal. And what's interesting to me is that like during the rape of Nanking, 300,000 people were killed in the matter of 6 weeks. And what's terrifying is that like the foreigners in Nanjing also established like an international zone to save like women and children. And one of the international zone like savior was actually a German Nazi. And he wrote to the Nazi party telling them how brutal the Japanese soldiers were. And he said, well, maybe we should not be friends with these guys. But the ironic part is that, like, in 2 years, the Germans were also the Nazis were infamous for what they were doing. In 1937, though, John Rabe, who was one of the Nazi in the international zone, who was protecting women and children, actually used a swastika flag on his building to try to like protect people.
That is
So,
an interesting fact there.
so I just thought that was very fascinating.
I think it would serve well to talk about maybe the parallels between the human experimentation that was happening in Japan, it will also what we know happened
Yes,
disregard for human life to experiment to try to just see what can happen to a human body with when there's no like
science
safeguards or
ethics.
no ethics at all. Exactly. Because
Yeah, I
it
found
seems like
her.
something that is not well known, at least in the Western world, about what happened in China and Japan with that aspect of it.
Yeah, so I heard one of your episodes with the Oswald about the German experimentation, and
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was very interesting because everyone knows about Mengele, Joseph Mengele. They all knew that he, did human experimentation, but not everyone knows who Ishishiro was. So Ishishiro was a scientist who had huge ambitions. He knew that the West was writing rules about germs with Geneva Convention. So then he thought that let's harness germs so that we can actually turn Japan into a world power. So he started researching, and he also had this very interesting device that can filter his own pee into water. And he knew that one of the weaknesses during the Russo-Japanese War was because of clean water. Like the Japanese soldiers were kind of weakening by drinking dirty water. So he peed inside one of the water filter that he made in front of the emperor. And the emperor was so impressed because the emperor was also like a hobbyist biologist. So the emperor gave him funding right away. And so then he established a germ warfare and also like water purification, but his front was water purification. And so he established that in Tokyo at first. But then he thought, well, if I'm in Tokyo, this is too loud. Everyone is going to know, and then I'm eventually going to get found out, even though I have the emperor's backing. It could not end well for me, if public opinion sways one way or another. And so by the time Japan occupied Manchuria in 1931, he was very excited because he thought, well, Manchuria is far enough from Japan that no one's going to know what is happening. And so he took like a road trip with his friends to Manchuria and basically scout out a place to establish his lab. At first, he established it in like a soy sauce factory where it's far enough from other people, but his guards were having a good time during like Autumn Moon Festival and got drunk. And one of the prisoners got out and they all ran out. And so then he thought, oh shoot, now people are going to know what I'm doing. So he actually moved his lab again to Pingfong, which is near Harbin. That's like the closest town to Pingfong at the time. And he took over like this whole town. He evicted all the villagers and he established this Unit 731, which was a big base for what he was doing. He established a ton of buildings for human experimentation. He was producing like biological weapons. He testing biological weapons and just basically trying to see what would work well in terms of a wartime like weapon. So he had also this place where he would drop, it's called the anti-testing ground. And when I was reading about it, it was really disgusting. So I thought, let's talk about that. He tied his victims to like stakes, kind of like cross, and he would drop these bombs that he was developing. And inside these bombs, there were like anthrax and like glanders. And then he also developed this fleas bomb. So and at first, like in the beginning of this fleas bomb, he had made it out of steel. But then when he was testing these humans, he realized that he should make it out of porcelain because the porcelain shatters a lot faster and can deploy the fleas bomb a lot easier. And so he did that. And then he was also testing out, like, because Manchuria was very cold. So then one of his scientists figured out, like, how to do frostbite testing. And so, like, they would leave humans outside and then tie them to a stake and then see, like, how their limbs would react. And then they would chop off a part of a limb to see, like, how it's looking inside. And yeah, one of the experiments was pretty nasty. He was trying to replace one of the scientists at that work there was trying to see if like human blood can be replaced with horse blood. So then they would like pump out this blood and then pump in horse blood, and then like obviously the victim died. And there was basically no survivor from from Unit 731. And he learned from also his initial failure of getting found out. So he actually installed his brother as the top prison guard so then he can ensure that no one would get out of Unit 731 alive. He also tested out, so there were reports of like anthrax, glanders, and the plague. And he was basically testing out like how those would react in human bodies. And what's interesting is also that like if you look at the sample of these people that were being tested, it goes from like 3-year old to like 80-year old. So you know that like the age of these victims were all over the board. And yeah, it was really disgusting times. And but after the war, and it was not just like Unit 731 as well. They were doing all these kind of human experimentations also with like the whole Japanese empire. We recently interviewed a guy whose father worked at Unit 1644, and he told me that that was probably one of the biological weapons like research lab as well. He had no idea what was happening. He only has some ideas because everything was so secretive. And recently, when I was going through Yokohama trial, I realized that like there were also a group of B-29 bombers who were shot down near the end of the war in near Tokyo, and they were also used for human experimentation in front of like a college campus as well. Like, students just go in and then they get to see this human experimentation happening in front of them in real time in front of a college camp lecture. And what's interesting is that like one of the grandnephew of the guy who was used for human experimentation recently reached out because he saw my blog post and thanked us for actually kind of, remembering what had happened to his granduncle. And I figured that he didn't know about what had happened to his family member either until very recently when these documents were actually declassified.
When when were these documents declassified?
So some of the Unit 731 documents were declassified as late as 2014.
So pretty recent.
So this is like decades of cover up. And this happened because right after the surrender, the United States sent 3 investigators to Japan, and Arvo Thompson, Murray Sanders, and Norbert Fell. Murray Sanders was actually one of the earliest investigator, and he was like, wow, we can never do this in the beginning. I mean, in peacetime anywhere. And so he thought, well, we need to buy it. So he got the wheel started to buy these like reports from the Japanese scientists. And then Arvo Thompson and later Norbert Fell actually worked on the immunity deal and purchased the whole packet from Unit 3731 scientists to give them a deal. And so a lot of these scientists ended up with like very high paying jobs and just they because they got an immunity deal. Some of them became politicians. It's also noteworthy that in the Nuremberg trial, a few scientists actually faced trial, but like in terms of Unit 731, the only like scientists who actually faced trial were in Soviet Union, the Khabarovsk trial. And but at the time, because the Cold War was starting, the press had actually called the Soviet Union trial like a communist trial, like a communist kangaroo trial, and so the West did not take it very seriously.
I think it's important to just make it very clear that a lot of these actions were state sanctioned, like how you were talking about how it had emperor approval in Germany. This was all stuff that the government was doing. Like, this wasn't just a couple of people who were doing things on the down low. These were things that were happening from the very tops of the government. Like,
Yes.
it wasn't like a secret operation. It was something that it was a secret, as in they didn't want the public as a whole to find out, but it was being led by the people at the very top, which is, I think, something that we want to remember.
Yeah, and it's very dark because at the same time, because Ishishiro was getting so much money from the government that every scientist wanted to be like him. And so some of the trial that I was reading, like from one of the doctor at a forced labor camp, he wanted to be Ishishiro so bad that he started experimenting on the POWs that were held at his camp. And like he would shoot up like soy milk to see if like bloodstream can take it. And so this is what happens when science is operating without ethics and when greed really become the motivation to guide the scientists.
That was very well put. When it comes to these records having been sealed, can you clarify if they were sealed due to an agreement or sealed just because they had not been, I don't know how I want to say this. Like, if it was like an agreement between the scientists and the investigators, or if it was just the cogs of government.
I think a lot of it is due to the deal that was made.
The deal that was.
If you're in the middle of the Cold War and China's evil and you don't want to look evil as well, I think the best way to do it would just be have a complete cover up. And this also goes to like Operation Paperclip, where they brought Nazi scientists into the United States despite what they were doing during World War II, and that's how they won. I mean, that's how they were entering the space race.
I can't remember his name, but one of the Nazi scientists who became a very prominent scientist, I believe, with NASA, with making the spaceships and all of that, forgiving the atrocities to still be able to use the brain of someone who, because they are scientists and they are very smart individuals, but they let the want to find out information that we didn't really need to know exactly how all of these things affected people, but they just kept the need for more information from stopping them from thinking about all these people that they were experimenting on as people and not just experiments. And we put that aside to still be able to use their brains because they were smart people. They were knowledgeable, and they just made the worst decisions possible.
Right, because it's science without ethics. Like, I'm pretty sure doctors swear like an oath to not hurt others. And that's what also was so heartbreaking when I was reading these testimonies for Yokohama trial about the B-29 pilots who were being vivisected. One of the students at this lecture was like, I never want to be doctor again because like this is pretty horrific stuff. And he was also like, when the pilots were being pushed into the lecture, you can see the hope in them because they probably thought that they were going to be saved. But then instead, they were basically butchered on the table. And like one of them had their lungs removed to see how long they can last without his lungs. And like other experiment included like seeing if they can replace saline with like seawater. So it was pretty brutal kind of experimentation. And yeah.
So I think we will leave the human experimentation and maybe move on to probably also some also terrible things. But I think maybe we can look more into the Pacific theater during World War II, maybe a little bit of the things that maybe aren't taught in your typical classroom here in the US.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that, like, in the Philippines as well, I'm sure you did an episode about the Philippines. So, like, 8 hours after Pearl Harbor, the Philippines was attacked. And what's interesting is that At first, the Filipinos were like, oh gosh, finally, Japan is coming to liberate us from our Western imperialists. And at the same time, but then as soon as they saw how brutal Japan was, they were able to kind of pick up arms, and they were so resourceful on like how to fight back. They kept the resistance going, even though MacArthur was saying that I shall return, and they were basically left like without resources to fight, and they held that on. I remember from your podcast episode as well, you talked about that.
How they just kind of, the at the time it was like the Philippines were like on their way to sort of independence, and the US was kind of just still there but like not fully, so they weren't really invested in it as much as they I don't think they were really invested in it from the beginning as some of the other territories that the US had, and they really just did not do anything to protect the people of the Philippines.
And I always wonder how much longer could the Philippines hold out had the US not been there to direct things. Does that make sense? Like the way that the United States also colonized the Philippines as well. Not a lot of people know about this, but like more Filipinos died during fighting for their independence, during being colonized by America than Americans died in D-Day. Like 400,000 people like died in the Philippines from being colonized. What's interesting is that colonizing Philippines was actually like a very terrible public opinion at first. People didn't
Mm-hmm.
really know where the Philippines was. They were like, can't we just mind our own business? And then like Teddy Roosevelt contacted Smithsonian to have like this human zoo in the St. Louis World
Yeah.
Fair. Yeah, and then had like shaved teeth with their with the people that they captured, and then called them like, oh, very uncivilized and whatnot. And yeah, and then that the rest was history. And so the US, that's how US was able to turn that public opinion around and also kept the Philippines. It's very interesting as I was doing research, and we were able to also interview these women who lived in the Central Coast. They were Panay fighting. And just some of their bravery, because you normally don't hear about women fighting in like World War II, and just some of their braveries on like how they face Japan, who were like the Japanese, who were like an oppressor. That was very like they were just radicalized because of how brutal Japan was. And the ration was also interesting because like there was a food scientist who then made like banana ketchup, which is now like a Filipino
Yeah.
staple. And it's very, in a way, it's also very brave for them to do that. And I also want to talk about like biological weapon. So after Pearl Harbor, right after Pearl Harbor as well, not a lot of people know about this now. I don't know why, but the FDR sent a crew of Doolittle Raiders to bomb Japan, essentially. And so the only way for the raiders to get out was either never, because you're probably going to get shut down and die, or you can go through China, Russia, and the people who went through Russia were detained for like a couple of years. And then there were pilots who actually made it back to like areas of China who weren't like occupied by Japan yet. And so then when Japan realized that like Chinese villagers were helping out the pilots, the Doolittle Raider pilots, got onto the radar, and Unit 731 also did like a biological weapons like deployment in this village. So they like sprayed anthrax and glanders onto this village soil. And what was terrifying is that even decades later, this village still had soil containing anthrax and glanders. And people's limbs like were either rotted or like just fell off because anthrax and like infection, skin infection. And it wasn't until like the 2010s that they figure out like skin grafting. So like a lot of people just wanted to work on their land. They were like farmers, and they ended up with like the nastiest infections. It smelled bad because it was constantly having like pus coming out. And so I thought and it was only in recent years, this woman named Wan Shen brought these victims to court in Japan, and Japan finally acknowledged that they did that in wartime China. And so not a lot of people think about like Unit 731 as just like human experimentation, but they actually like developed these deadly and nasty like biological weapons to kind of, and in a way I can't imagine what they were thinking about too, because once you deploy this kind of nasty biological weapons, right, it's not like you can just bleach it and then it will be out of the
Yeah,
soil.
you can't undo it. It's there for a long time, for generations.
Yeah, and so I think it's is also not talked about. But the court acknowledged that there's units that like they did deploy biological weapons. Japan did deploy biological weapons, but they would like not pay the victims. And like it's kind of heartwarming and also frustrating at the same time to see like some of these victims wearing socks for the first time after like so many decades of their legs rotting away.
Yeah. The lasting effects of war are something that I don't think we really think about too much. We think about when the war started, about the war itself, and the war ended in maybe the few years after it, but we don't really tend to think the long term effects of after a war has ended, because something like this, where there's anthrax in the soil, that's going to be something that's there, that's going to last. It's not just going to go away, it's going to have lasting effects for generations. And we don't really tend to think about that, or think about the after effects of war on not just the people who experience, but also the people who come after.
And the guy who actually came up with the way to powderize anthrax later became a executive for a Japanese pharmaceutical company. So that just shows like how there was no justice.
No justice at
Yeah.
all. I think what you're doing with your website and your research is really important, especially as someone who received my K-12 education in Florida, and then I did go to university. And a lot of the things that I have learned about World War II, not in the Eurocentric space, but more in like the Pacific theater and beyond, is through my own reading. Or I had my very last senior seminar class was called The American Empire, and we talked about how the US is an empire and we don't tend to think about it that way. And just starting to look at my own country as something that was an empire and all the things that have happened in the past, it just helps to broaden my understanding of other things that have happened in the past, of how everything is connected in a certain way. And it's not just one chronological timeline that you learn in history class, it's a bunch of things happening all at the same time that are interconnected.
And also, like, yeah, we never learn about America as an imperialist power. It's like
Never.
imperialism is something bad that, you know, the French or the British did, but never the United States. And I think it's also kind of ex time to examine, you know, not just World War II, not just after World War II, like Cold War deals, but also like, you know, the empire that was being built starting as like McKinley's age.
Yes, I
Yeah.
totally agree. There's a lot of internal looking that still has to happen in the US of how we've gotten to where we are today. It's not just the hits like the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, you know, the things that you learn about in your typical history class. It's going beyond that and looking at everything else that's happening in that time, that like how we got to those places, not just the events themselves.
And it's also interesting because like I have a lot of very highly educated friends and they had no idea, and then they were like, "Oh, maybe Chinese people just need to get over it. You know, China and Japan are both great countries." And I'm like, "Are you going to go tell Jewish people to get over the Holocaust?" And that just shows like how much of a gap there is in terms of like education and in terms of also looking at things so in a Western centric sense. Like 30 million to 42 million people. Like that's 30 million is a low estimate for Asia. that died from World War II, and there were also lasting effects, and not a lot of people learn about it. And then they were like, "Oh, can the Chinese or like can the other Asian people get over it?" I feel like that's a very highly insensitive way to look at it. Korea is still doing their weekly Wednesday protests because of comfort women. Why is it that people need to get over it, especially if it has intergenerational effects?
I wish that was just spoken about in general more because it's not something that I ever was taught or I learned in school. It's something that I've learned on my own or in my very last classes in college. Like my senior level classes is when we finally started talking about it. It wasn't something that was just a part of the general education. It was something extra. It was like an elective. It was an extra class you had to take. It wasn't something that was part of the main story.
And even so, then I feel like this is not something that you would learn in high school. Like people need to do their independent research. And last year I was so impressed because this group of high school students reached out and said that, oh, we're doing some independent research about Unit 731. And then they did like a documentary for National History Day. And then they won like first place in New Mexico, which I thought was super impressive given the fact that like they're high school students and they're already doing like their own independent research. And like their judges for the documentary didn't even know about Unit 731, and they were like, "Oh, we didn't even know that happened. We only know about Auschwitz."
Yeah, it's very much a blind spot in our history,
And in a
human
way, I would
people.
say that it also has more to do with America because, American obviously did all this cover up. And also before Japan surrendered, Ishishiro had a plan to actually do Operation Cherry Blossom to release all of his ceramic bombs in a balloon and fly them into California to like effect to basically do a biological warfare with America because they weren't winning in terms of traditional warfare. So I think it has more to do with America than Americans think.
I agree. Do you want to talk a little bit about Operation Cherry Blossom, like maybe in a little bit more depth? I think that might be something that people may have heard of, that maybe they don't know all the details.
Yeah, so Operation Cherry Blossom was basically a operation where it was toward the end of the war and they were thinking about basically tying a bunch of these fleece bombs into balloons and just flying it across the Pacific and just kind of cross your fingers and hope that hits California. And and had the war been still going, that was going to be the plan, like thousands of balloons. And this is the same time when Japan was also releasing like balloons during the Emperor Meiji's birthday, but they were incendiary balloons. And it actually reached some of the incendiary balloons actually reached like Oregon. And there were a bunch of like paratroopers, like black paratroopers who stopped the wildfire that could have burned down in Oregon when these like balloons, incendiary balloons actually dropped in Oregon. And these are not something that we talk about because, obviously, I think Black Americans, like World War II experiences, are often erased. And also, like, fighting forest fire is not as sexy as, like, dropping a flag on Iwo Jima, right? Those are not the stories that would be told, in a sense.
I also think that we don't like to talk about American weakness. And that would
No.
be something that would have exemplified a weakness in our defenses, in just our general just being. 'Cause, America likes to put off that we're strong, that no harm can be done to us. We are just, kind of like that, like big strong man
Yes,
kind
but
of.
at the same time, America, if you think about it, America hasn't won a war in the last 80 years,
Very
not with
true.
like an equal power, and
Yeah.
it's very And in terms of like the war continuing after World War II as well, if you think about it, 1945 wasn't quite a liberation day for Asia. It was more like they were continuing to fight their oppressors, like in Vietnam.
Mhm.
Ho Chi Minh actually reached out to United States for help first at first, and
Yeah.
his like liberation like independence speech was actually directly copied from Thomas Jefferson. But just like how US did not want to give Philippines freedom, they fought with the French to kind of keep them down.
Yeah, they definitely don't like to show any weakness or to step down, like to step away, to say like to back down, like to kind of back away. That's not
Yeah.
something.
And
Um,
also the like America is very involved in the Pacific since like Teddy Roosevelt
mhm.
was in power. Teddy Roosevelt even gave Korea to Japan, and in a way that started the whole kickstart the whole colonization of Korea, and Korea suffered so many years under Japan after the Treaty of Portsmouth.
Yeah, we like to put our hands in things and not really admit when we are wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
so I think I would want, for your listeners who are listening to your podcast is a great start, but also they should also do a lot more independent research.
yes, for sure. Do you want to, is there anything else that you want to talk about today, or do you want to talk about
Let's
maybe
start.
some more resources that you have?
Yeah, let's talk about. We have a weekly podcast as well on Pacific Front. People can find it on YouTube and Spotify. James Bradley, who's they thought his father dropped the flag on Iwo Jima, and it turned out that it wasn't him. The Marines just wanted like a clean story, and his father was one of the survivors. Then he was brought onto like this war bonds tour. Anyway, long story short, he's one of the frequent guests. He comes on our podcast like twice a month, and he has a lot to talk about in terms of World War II. He even brought like Bush to Chichijima to see because Bush was one of the rescued airmen out of Chichijima, but the other 8 airmen were actually eaten by the Japanese during this incident, and that's like one of his books, Fly Boys. And yeah, he has a lot to talk about from like his decades of research into the Pacific. And of course, people can find us on our website, pacificatrocities.org, or Instagram, Pacific Atrocities EDU.
Awesome. I will definitely link to, the webpage, the podcast. Is there anything else that you want to link? Any projects that you guys are working on?
They can find out about our latest project on our blog or Instagram.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for coming on. I think this was a very eye-opening episode for some listeners, especially those who are unfamiliar with the Pacific Theater in general. I think this is a good place for them to start and to find your website, your podcast, and look into it a little bit more and really see what else was happening during World War II and stuff that they just never were taught and never learned.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you. Thank you again to Jenny for coming on the show and sharing this side of history that is often overlooked in Western classrooms. I have linked the Pacific Atrocities Education website below. There are various blog posts and podcasts to explore. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.